بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. So, alhamdulillah, last week there was some discussion on what we should do on Tuesday nights, and then some of the attendees over the last couple of weeks kind of suggested that we have a couple of weeks before Ramadan, why don't we do this topic of Fiqh of Priorities? And since I've already had it prepared for a number of years, I agreed. And it's a very, very important topic actually, and it's basically most of what we're going to cover is based out of a text by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, hafidhahullah, and the text is called Fi Fiqh al-Awlawiyat, so it's on the Fiqh of Priorities. And one of the nice things that's said about this work was said by Mufti Taqi Osmani. Mufti Taqi, for those of you who are not familiar with him, he's a major judge and scholar in Pakistan, and one of the big scholars from that area. So a lot of the brothers who have studied over there were students of his, especially in the field of Islamic economics. He's very prominent. So he has a statement about this work and about Sheikh al-Qaradawi. He says, frequently he chooses for his writings novel topics toward which no previous author has directed their attention. See, for instance, his unprecedented work on the Fiqh of Priorities. For in it he has indeed discussed an important Islamic principle that many people have ignored, even the scholars and callers to Islam. And ignoring it has caused great tribulation among Muslims. And despite that, no author had dedicated an independent work to it. When a person reads the likes of these books, he feels as though the author, God preserve him, is expressing thoughts that had remained hidden in scholars' minds for long periods of time, until the author came and gave them an eloquent tongue, and brought them out into the realm of exactitude and compilation in a way that generalized its benefit and made it more comprehensive. So basically the point here is that someone who sometimes may be considered to have a different approach in fiqh and in the derivation of rulings, Mufti Taqi is generally considered to have a different approach than Sheikh Qaradawi, but yet he's saying that this work is a very, very important work, and in particular it's a topic that exists in different parts of Islamic law and different parts of Islamic studies, but yet no book was actually written solely on that topic before this book was written. So it's really something that he kind of initiated this field of study. So in the original preparation of this series, there were 8 lectures, but obviously we're not going to cover 8 lectures in 3 weeks. So what we'll do is we'll kind of try to go as quickly as possible through some things, and we'll skip other things that maybe are not as important and focus on the ones that are important as an application of the concept of priorities itself. Anyways, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. What is Fiqh of Priorities? What is Fiqh of Priorities? Fiqh al-Awlawiyat. He said, وَضْعُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ فِي مَرْتَبِتِهِ بِالْعَدْلِ ثم يقدم الأولى فالأولى بناء على معايير شرعية صحيحة. So this means basically the Fiqh of Priorities is to put everything in its appropriate place with justice, and you give precedence to that which is most important and then the next most important according to the guidelines of the correct guidelines of the Sharia. So the idea here is essentially at any given time you have a lot of obligations to fulfill. And so how do you figure out which one takes priority over the other? In reference, in keeping in mind the guidance of the Sharia itself, helping you to make that decision. So some people will say, well, what's the evidence of this concept? Because a lot of people, when you talk to them, they don't really come to this understanding. It's either halal or it's not halal, or it's haram, or if it's haram, it's haram. If it's wajib, it's wajib. If it's mustahab, it's mustahab. Whatever it is, it's just the ruling and that's it. But actually, it's not. That's true at some level. If it's haram, it's haram. That's true. But 2 harams are not necessarily equal in how haram they are. And this is basically the issue. And same thing with 2 wajibs. Both things might be an obligation, but one might be a higher obligation than the other. So this is something that people don't always understand, and it's something that's very, very important to keep in mind. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, for example, in Surah Al-Rahman, والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان أن لا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان. And the sky, He raised it and He put the balance in things so that you will not exceed the balance. And give due weight to everything with justice and do not betray that balance. So the idea here is that Allah actually put and placed the creation of everything with balance and with a certain order. And the responsibility then of the individual is to understand that order and then know the guidelines of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to put everything in its place. In another verse He said subhanahu wa ta'ala وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْمِيزَانَ لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ. And we sent our messengers to mankind with evidences, and we gave them the book and the scale so that people can judge things with balance and equity. So one of the points that's made here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا. He says, we have sent our messengers, plural. So the idea is that part of the job actually of the messenger is that the messenger with the guidance from Allah, with the divine guidance, is able to be in the world and balance between all of the obligations and clarify to people based on evidence how they're supposed to do that. And this is a prophetic condition, or this is a prophetic example that exists between all of the messengers. So it's something that is there always. Another thing that kind of shows this concept of priorities is the concept of ihsan itself. The concept of ihsan. So ihsan in the Muslim tradition is a very, very important concept. And again, this is one of those things that oftentimes get lost. But the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَتَبَ الْإِحْسَانَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. That Allah has written ihsan in everything. He has written ihsan, excellence, in everything. So He says, if you slaughter, then do the slaughter well, and if you kill the animal, then kill the animal well, and one of you should sharpen their knife. So basically the Prophet ﷺ is giving even an example that many people would overlook. Think, well, it's just an animal. We're just going to slaughter the animal and we're going to eat it. It's just our food. But He's saying, even in something like this, there should be ihsan. There should be excellence. And this is one of the great traditions actually of Muslim societies and Muslim cultures, that should be there. And you'll see it usually in some places more than others. Turks usually have very high levels of ihsan, Turkish people. There's a story that I heard one time of someone who visited a Turkish family, and they went in and it looked like the bed sheets were so well done that they thought they were ironed. They kind of joked with them like, the bed sheets look like they're ironed. You guys iron your bed sheets for the guests? Like, yeah, who doesn't do that? It wasn't a question of like, do you do it or not? Do you not? I'm like, who doesn't do that? Of course we iron our bed sheets for our guests. It has to look nice. This is a completely different level of ihsan. And actually, it's that excellence in all areas of worship and all areas of life leads to a higher level of spirituality. But the concept itself requires that you know what's most important. You can't have excellence if you don't know which thing is most important. There's also other things in the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ. For example, in the hadith, الإيمان بضع وسبعون شعبة أعلاها لا إله إلا الله وأدناها إماتة الأذى عن الطريق. That the Iman, faith, is 70-something branches. And the highest of those branches is to say La ilaha illallah, is to have the declaration of faith. And the lowest of them is to remove something harmful from the road. So he's saying, you see the point here is that he's saying Iman is 70 branches. The highest is this, and the lowest is this. Which means what? All of those are part of Iman, but some of them are more important than others. Right? Some of them are more important than others. The Prophet ﷺ also said, Salat al-Jama'ah تفضل صلاة الفجر ب 27 درجة. Very famous hadith, most people know it. That the prayer in congregation is better than the prayer by yourself by 27 times. The prayer is an obligation either way, right? Either way I have to pray Maghrib. Either way I have to pray Maghrib. But Maghrib in Jama'ah, in congregation, is better than Maghrib by yourself. Both of them are obligations, but they're not the same level of obligation. He also said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, أَسْرَقُ النَّاسِ الَّذِي يصرف صلاته لا يتم ركوعها ولا سجودها وأبخل الناس من بخل بالسلام. That the worst of thieves is the one who steals from their prayer. They don't finish its ruku' and they don't finish its sujood. Okay, so the worst of thieves is the one who steals from their prayer. So what does that mean? It means there's levels of thieves. Some of them are bad, some of them are really bad. The worst of them is the one who steals from their prayer. And then it says, and the most stingy of people is the one who is stingy with saying salam. The most stingy of people is someone who's stingy with saying salam. So again, there's levels of stingy people. This is something that maybe I would encourage people to be extra wary with this one when it comes to converts. Converts are usually more sensitive when it comes to salam. Because people come into Islam and they read about salam and they see how Adam alayhi salam, this is the first thing Allah taught him, and this is the greeting of the people of paradise, and when you say salam you lose your sins, and it's the way that Muslims should greet each other, and all of these things. So when someone doesn't say salam to them, or someone doesn't return the salam to them, it's very serious. They consider like, how is that? Either they don't think that I'm a Muslim or they're not a Muslim. It gets very serious sometimes. There's a story about it, but I don't want to go on to it, but it can get very serious. So again, the Fiqh of Priorities is to put everything in its place with justice, giving precedence to the most important, then the next important, according to the guidelines of the Sharia. So how did this show up? Like, what are some of the examples of negligence of the Fiqh of Priorities in our Ummah today? And what are some of the things that show its importance? So the first is that there's a negligence of the Fiqh of Priorities within the Ummah as a whole. You look at, for example, art and leisure are given priority over knowledge and teaching, almost always, right? Art and leisure are given priority over knowledge and teaching. You go to a class, you see how many people are there. You go to a festival, see how many people are there. Right? It's maybe there's a big scholar in town or something. Usually we don't have this as much here, but maybe there's a big scholar in town. You see how many people come out. Might be more, might be less. But see how many people stay up in the middle of the night to watch the World Cup in Ramadan. Right? It's going to be a lot of people up. So the priority is actually given to art and leisure over acts of worship, which is not to say that you can't do those things. But it is to say that we should think about how we spend our time. Another example is that physical exercise is generally given priority over mental exercise. People are usually a lot more concerned with their bodies than they are with their minds. And this is really, really actually a problem that has to be considered. What did the poet say? يا خادم الجسم كم تشقى بخدمته أتطلب الربح فيما فيه خسران. Oh, you who is serving your body, how much pain you put yourself through in order to make your body better. Are you seeking profit in that which is in loss? Basically, at the end of the day, your body is still going to go away. You're going to get older, things are going to break down. It doesn't mean you shouldn't care about your health. But it means that, some people, they care about their health so much, they don't care about other things. There should be a balance in these things. Or they just care about their health and they don't care about anything else. And not necessarily their health. Some people care about their body so much that it's more like bodybuilding and these things. It's sometimes not even good for your health. But they'll ruin their health even so their body looks good. And one of the statements of one of the early scholars is very important. He said, مَا رَأَيْتُ إِسْرَافًا إِلَّا وَبِجَانِبِهِ حَقٌّ وَذِكْرٌ. He said, I did not see anything that someone practiced excess in, except that alongside it, someone else's right was lost. So, I didn't see an excess in something, except that the consequence was someone's right was lost. So if you think, for example, alhamdulillah, we don't have this here. So think, for example, a masjid comes and they spend $50,000 on a chandelier. For example, it happens. Masjid spends $50,000 on a chandelier. And so the chandelier sits there and it's an excess expense. There's really no purpose for it except to have something that makes you feel nice in the masjid, which you could do by other means that are much cheaper. But at the same time, there's no youth programming, for example. So there's no youth programming, but there's money for the chandelier. You ask them, can we get a youth director so there can be youth programming? They say, no, we don't have money. $50,000 could have hired someone to work that position for an entire year. They'll be there day in and day out, programming, talking to young people, dealing with their issues, organizing things, dealing with all the questions of atheism and evolution and drug and alcohol addiction, everything else that we have in our community. But instead there's a chandelier. So the result is that I've never seen an excess, except that the consequence is someone else's right is lost. And this is the same application as we talked about before. Imam al-Sarakhsi, the great Hanafi scholar, in his discussion on food, that he said it's haram to overeat. And one of the reasons he gave for it being haram to overeat is because if you overeat, then the excess food that was put into your stomach, or the money that was spent on that excess food, could have gone to feed someone who's hungry. And it didn't go to feed someone who's hungry. So that person's right was lost. So it's haram. That's what he says. This is like an old book, and he says this. So the idea here is that there's an excess, and the consequence of that excess was that someone lost their right. There are many examples of actually negligence of fiqh of priority, even amongst, we'll start with practicing Muslims. So practicing Muslims usually think, observant Muslims think that they're better off, but there's many examples of this within practicing Muslims. One of them is related to what I just said. Generally speaking, people have more interest in caring about buildings rather than people. So they'll spend money on a masjid in a country filled with them instead of supporting Muslims that are more in need. So maybe there's like a masjid, maybe you live in a place where there's tons of masajid. So the person has some extra money, instead of spending the money on someone who needs it, they'll build another masjid. It's a complete waste, right? It's a good thing. You can't say that it's not a good thing, but we'll get to later that ruining the priority between good things is actually a bad thing. We're going to come to it, Imam al-Ghazali. But this happens also in masajid administration. Usually we care more about the building than the people who are in the building. But actually what makes a place is the people who are in the building. And a good example of this is Saddleback Church. People know how huge Saddleback Church is. Saddleback Church is probably, if not the most influential, one of the most influential Christian communities in the world. Okay, and their church is here in Saddleback Valley, just about 15 minutes from here. And for years and years and years, they didn't have a facility. They moved from place to place to place to place. When they finally had a facility, they worshipped in an igloo for an extremely long period of time. Until finally they had a good amount of money, and they were able to open a good facility, right? But their focus in all of that time was on people, because people is what actually matters. The second example of this would be how many of the people on Hajj are fulfilling their fard? How many of the people on Hajj are fulfilling their fard? And I think the example is going to come later, but so I won't go into too much detail of it. But basically, if someone's starving, it's a bigger priority to pay that person, to stop that person from starving, than it is to make an extra Hajj. Period. There's no debate on this. If you think about it for a few seconds, you realize it, okay? So $10,000 that it costs to make an extra Hajj, like $10,000, you can live an upper middle class existence for a family in Egypt on $10,000 a year. It's not, in Egypt it costs a little bit more than other places. So it's a lot of money. It can affect a lot of people's lives. But we'll come to it in more detail later. Imam al-Ghazali in his time, he rebuked all of the people because too many of them were studying fiqh and not enough of them were studying medicine, the opposite of our times. So Imam al-Ghazali in his time, this was the issue. Studying fiqh is a good thing, right? He's saying, in the end of the day, studying fiqh is a societal obligation, communal obligation, and studying medicine is a communal obligation. We need people who are doing both. And everyone's going to study fiqh, and no one's going to study medicine. It's a problem. So this is a mix of priorities, even amongst people who are observant, and they're good. And another big one, I'll leave with this one, is, or two of them. One of them is people who are very good, and they do a lot of acts of worship, and they do all of these things, but then they treat their families bad. So someone might go, they might volunteer, they might do nice things, they might do whatever, then they go home, they curse at their families, they yell at them, they act in belligerent ways, whatever it might be. So all of those extra things that the person did were sunnah. Like putting away the tables, organizing things, whatever they might be. But how they treat their family, that's fun. It's an obligation. So there's a mix of priorities in the end. And the other thing is sometimes we get stuck in the small issues and we forget the big ones. It's just we do that. So for example, usually we talked about this last year with Taraweeh. Usually Taraweeh is a big discussion. Should it be 20? Should it be 8? How long should it be? We're going to finish late. All of these different things that happen, right? And people will get very upset and they do different things. And in the end of the day, Taraweeh is a sunnah. And unity is an obligation. Unity is an obligation. It's wajib. So it's not as important. There's a famous story that I mentioned before, Imam Hassan al-Banna, when he was called to one of the villages, and he was in one of the villages in Egypt, and there's a big debate. They asked him, should it be 8 or should it be 20? He said, you should go home. Like, if you're going to fight over the sunnah, you should just go home. Pray your Taraweeh at home and save the community. It's more important. But that's actually the true answer. My take on Taraweeh, maybe in future years we can discuss this. My current take on Taraweeh is that we should pray 8 rak'ah, and we shouldn't read much of the Quran at all, and we should finish earlier, and we should have a dars afterwards for 20 to 30 minutes on issues that are important to people. And whoever wants to finish the juz can stay after Fajr the next morning, and Sheikh Muhammad or someone can read the rest of the juz. I think it would be much more beneficial. Because most people, actually Ramadan, what we forget as people who come to the masjid regularly, Ramadan is da'wah season. Ramadan is not just about we get to do extra worship and things like that. The people who want to do extra worship, they're going to do it either way. But the question is, how can we use the opportunity to try to bring other people in and get them involved in the masjid and get them involved in the community and raise their level of understanding of Islam and get them committed and stuff in a time when we have an opportunity to do so. But that's a different discussion. Third, I'm going to skip that one because it's not as important. So there's a relationship between this fiqh of priorities and the concept of fiqh of balances. So fiqh al-awlawiyat and fiqh al-muwazanat. So balancing, so how do you know your priorities, and you have to be able to balance two. There's a relationship here, and this is it's all tied into the concept of masalih and mafasid. So it's all tied into the concept of harms and benefits. And the idea here is that, as Izzuddin ibn Abd al-Salam talked about in his really important work in Qawaid al-Kubra, he talks about how the Sharia is based on masalih, it's based on benefits. And on most things, if it's not an act of worship, on most things we can understand what the benefit is. And we have to think about these benefits and consider whether or not they are being fulfilled when we do the action. And so you have to worry about balancing between benefits themselves, and maybe two things are beneficial, or two things are harmful, or something's harmful and something's beneficial. So these are all different ways that this balancing occurs. The benefits themselves have 3 levels in Islamic law. We talked about this in the Monday book club, but for those who weren't there, benefits have 3 levels in Islamic law. There's daruriyat, there's hajiyat, and there's tahsiniyat. There's necessities and needs and luxuries. So everything that we find to be beneficial, everything that we're obligated to do, falls into one of these categories. Either it's something that's absolutely necessary, it's a need, or it's a luxury. Just because it's a luxury doesn't mean it's not wajib. It's still wajib, but this is a conversation on how to understand if they're competing, which one do you give priority to. So necessities are basically those things that the regular function of life is dependent upon. So basically your housing, food, shelter, these type of things. Food, shelter, health, so on. Regular everyday life depends on these things. If you don't have shelter, it's very hard to exist. If you don't have food, it's very hard to exist. So that's number one. Number 2 is needs, which are things that are they're important, but life is not going to stop if you don't have it. Okay, life is not going to stop if you don't have it. So an example of this would be a car in Southern California. car, more or less in Southern California, is a need. In rare cases, it may reach to be a necessity. In places outside of California, Southern California, where you have better transportation, it can sometimes also be a luxury. So it can vary. But in our context, it's something that it makes life much easier, and life becomes difficult if you don't have it. But life is not going to stop if you don't have a car. All you have to do is take a drive down to the street, and you'll notice as soon as people's income's lower, you see more people riding the bus. They still live, it's just harder. The third is luxuries. Life is not going to stop, it's not even going to get more difficult, it's just an extra thing. So I would say that people who have money, the vast majority of their existence revolves around these things. So, the new phone came out, I'm going to get the new phone, or new clothes, or whatever it may be. These are all just items, they're all purely luxury. Life doesn't revolve around these things, they're just extra stuff, it doesn't really matter. We think it matters, but it doesn't actually matter. If we were less spoiled, we'd probably know that. So these are the levels. The necessities fall into 5 major categories, and that's the preservation of faith, preservation of life, preservation of family, preservation of intellect, and preservation of wealth. So the 5 major necessities are these things. On a societal level, these 5 things must be preserved: faith, life, family, intellect, and health, and wealth. So all 5 of those must be there. Those are the most important. Even between those, there's priority. So deen takes priority over life. Life takes priority over family, or even sometimes wealth. These things. So you can give up your money if it's going to save your life, for example. You have to, actually. But these things are some of the levels there. There's also some rules. Most of them are logic-based, but they bear mentioning. For example, something that's certain comes before something that's uncertain. So you might be weighing a situation. One of the options you can have, the other one you're not sure if you can have it. So certain takes priority over uncertain. Big takes priority over small. Community takes priority over an individual. It's very important. Community takes priority over an individual. Sometimes an individual has to bear some sort of loss for the greater benefit of the community. An example of this would be jihad. Usually, jihad is an example of this. When it's legislated, it serves as it can be dangerous to the individual, but that danger to the individual is overlooked because of the benefit to the group. It serves to preserve the group. Many before few, long-term before short-term, foundational before peripheral. All of these, they make sense logically, but they're good things to keep in mind. One of the examples of this in the Sunnah and in the life of the Prophet ﷺ is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So the Treaty of Hudaybiyah is the Muslims, they went to Mecca to perform Umrah, and they weren't allowed to. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't perform Umrah that year. Eventually this contract occurs, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah occurs. There's 2 levels actually of examples of priorities in this. The first is in how the contract itself is, the scene of the contract being written. And the second one is in the content of the contract. So in the scene of the contract being written, the Prophet ﷺ, as someone who is unlettered, he was not the one writing the contract. Ali radiallahu anhu is the one who's writing the contract. So initially, they start off the contract, and the Prophet ﷺ tells him, write Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And the Quraysh, they say, don't write that because we don't say that. Say Bismillah, write it this way because that's what we say. We don't say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. That's what you guys say. So Ali looks at the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet tells him, erase it, go ahead, write what they asked you to write. So he writes it. Then he says, this is a contract between Muhammad Rasulullah ﷺ and Quraysh. So Quraysh, they say, don't write Rasulullah, just say Muhammad ibn Abdullah, Muhammad the son of Abdullah, because we don't accept you as the messenger of God. If we accepted you as the messenger of God, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Right? So Ali says, that's it. I'm not doing it. So the Prophet ﷺ tells him, show me where it is, and I'll erase it myself. So he points it to him, and he erases it himself. Right? And he writes Muhammad ibn Abdullah. So this is the Prophet ﷺ is giving up on something that's, in some ways superficial. It's an external thing. It's a superficial thing. In order to get the contract itself to go through, because there's a benefit in the contract that's more important than just the wording that's used. Is it Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, or is it Muhammad ibn Abdullah, or is it Muhammad Rasulullah? These things are subtleties that are less important than what's going to come out of the contract. So this is the first example of priorities in it. The second example is what's said in the contract itself. Part of it was that they do not make Umrah that year. They go back and they can come the next year and make it. And so, but the consequence of it is that there will be 10 years of peace. So to the Prophet ﷺ, his understanding was that by the guidance of Allah, that this is better. Yes, we don't get to go this year, and yes, we've been estranged from our land, and we want to go back, and this is so important to us, and so on. And we already came all the way this distance, but we're going to go back. Because the consequence is that this act of worship is not going to occur this year, but it will happen next year. And 10 years of peace is going to be a huge aid to the message of Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ is thinking about long-term and more important. What's more important? Is it more important for them to visit the house of Allah? Or is it more important to have a situation that will facilitate people coming into the message of Islam? Coming into the message of Islam is much more important than visiting the house of Allah, right? So, and then one is long-term and one is short-term. Visiting the house of Allah right now, it's an immediate thing, great. But 10 years of peace is a huge deal. So the Prophet ﷺ did this, and actually Umar radiallahu anhu, he was very upset. And he had a little discussion with Abu Bakr, and Abu Bakr basically told him, look, he's the messenger of Allah, we believe in him, let it go, you know. And eventually Umar let it go, and the Prophet ﷺ, then later on, they did this, they went back, they signed the treaty, everything. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called it, إِنَّا فَتَحْنَا لَكَ فَتْحًا مُبِينًا. Allah referred to it, we gave you a manifest victory. The beginning of Surah Al-Fatih. Some people think this is referring to Fath Mecca. It's not. It's not referring to the conquest of Mecca. The beginning of Surah Al-Fatih is not referring to the conquest of Mecca. It's referring to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The great victory of Islam actually was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Because that peace treaty allowed for all of the tribes of Arabia then to hear the message of Islam. And many of them came into Islam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized that this understanding of the Prophet ﷺ was the correct understanding. That it's not just about, we want to do this now, or this or that, something there's wisdom in it. That's why the Prophet ﷺ, his way is referred to as wisdom. In harms, there's also rules. So harm is removed as much as possible. Something that's harmful, it's removed as much as possible. Sometimes you can't do any better. And Asma is nodding her head, and I'm sure she understands this if anyone understands this, it's people who work in social work. You know, sometimes you get cases and you're like, this is the amount of harm that I can remove. This is the best I can do. There's still harm, still a bad situation. Next month they're not going to be able to pay rent, but at least this month they're able to pay rent. You know, there's only so much you can do. So harm is removed as much as possible. A harm is not removed by one that is equal or greater than it. A harm is not removed by one that is equal or greater than it. So one of the places that this applies is in the understanding of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about whoever from amongst you sees an evil thing, then let them change it by their hand, and if not, then by their tongue, and if not, then they should hate it in their heart, and that is the least of iman. This principle of harm is not to be removed by harm that's greater than it or equal to it, helps you to understand how to apply that hadith. So some people, when they're very, probably I myself was very similar early on, when they're very excited, they hear this hadith and they apply it to everything. Like, no, this is a harm and I'm removing it. And the consequence of removing it is to make everything worse. Like someone does something wrong. Is a good example. Okay? A good example is the masjid. Someone comes into the masjid, they do something that you think is wrong. I emphasize you think is wrong because sometimes it's not actually wrong and you don't know the other opinions, but you think it's wrong. And so you go to fix that wrong. But the consequence of fixing that wrong is that the person now no longer comes to the masjid. So you alleviated a harm by causing a greater harm. So it's not a proper application. Another concept is that you commit the lesser of two evils. If you're faced with a situation and you have to choose one or the other, you choose the one that's less bad. People say, well, you're telling people to do haram. Actually, the ruling changes. There's one of the things we don't understand also in Islam that will come up many times in the Fiqh of Priorities is that there's general rules and then there's specific applications. Okay? So the ruling can actually change in a specific application. So the general rule, for example, on marriage is that someone who has the means to get married, it's recommended for them to get married. Talked about this in the khutbah on marriage. But if someone knows that they will be oppressive to their spouse, then it becomes haram for them to become married. So the specific ruling for that person is that it's not allowed. But the general ruling is that it's recommended. So in the case that Ibn Taymiyyah talks about this a lot, it's very fascinating. But in the case that you have two things, they're both haram. But one of them is less harmful than the other. Then it becomes required that you choose the one that's less harmful. It becomes required that you choose the one that's less harmful, even if it's haram. Because that's what ends up being better in the end. And you're required to do what is better. You tolerate the lesser evil to repel the bigger one, tolerate the specific harm to repel the greater harm. General logic. When balancing between harms and benefits and all of these things, one of the major rules here is that the ruling goes to the majority. Whatever the majority is, the ruling goes to that. The example of this in the Quran is يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا. That this is the exact application of the principle. They ask you about alcohol and gambling. Say, in them is great sin and some benefit for people, but their harm is greater than their benefit. So it's not saying that someone might benefit from this. So someone, for example, who owns a liquor store, or they own a gas station and they sell liquor at the gas station, they make money off that drink, right? There's not going to be any barakah in the money because it's haram, but that's a different issue. But the idea here is one could argue that that's beneficial, right? And the idea is that the Quran is saying, actually no, the harms greatly outweigh the benefits. So it's recognizing that it's not always clear. And Ibn Abd as-Salam, Izzuddin Ibn Abd as-Salam, in the beginning of Qawaid al-Kubra, he says most of the things in life, they're not just clearly good or just clearly bad. When you look at it, it'll be like mostly bad, but you can make some argument that it's good. At some level, it can be said that it's good, or something is mostly good, but actually still there's some harm that can come from it. And you have to be able to balance those things. So this is all part of it. That's the introduction. Lecture 1 is done. Lecture 2, Fiqh of Priorities in Islamic History. So first part is where are some cases where this was used? Because a lot of times what happens is when, like I said, Shaykh al-Qaradawi was pretty much the first person to write a book on this topic. So a lot of people will come and they'll say, well, he made it up. Why did he just invent something new? We don't need something that we didn't have before. What the Salaf left us is enough. We should just follow our predecessors. Why is he innovating stuff in the religion? And so on. This is what people will say. So there's a section on examples of how this was applied throughout Islamic history. The first one is the story of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu with the people of Iraq. And this was after the death of Al-Hussein and the slaughtering of many members of the prophetic household radiallahu anhu. And so these people came to Iraq and they were in a state of ihram. And they came to Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, and they asked him, is it permissible for us to kill mosquitoes while we're in ihram? So Ibn Umar, he got upset and he said, these people, they're coming off of the slaughtering of the household of the Prophet ﷺ, and now they're coming here and asking if they can kill a mosquito when they're in ihram. Like, what is wrong with these people? They've lost their minds. This is an issue of priorities. He's commenting on an issue of priorities. Ibn Battal, who was a famous Maliki scholar, he comments on that story, and he said that this story shows the obligation of managing priorities. And he's a very old Maliki scholar. Another example of this is a discussion between Abdullah ibn Mubarak and Fudayl ibn Iyad. So Abdullah ibn Mubarak and Fudayl, they were very early righteous people and scholars. And there's this little correspondence that goes on between them. So, one of them was known to go out into the frontier areas and fight in battles and stuff like that, and the other one was known to just stay in the Haram, stays in Mecca and Medina only. And the conversation that occurs between them is basically, he writes him a poem, and Abdullah bin Mubarak writes a poem to Fulayl, and he says basically, all this worship that you're doing, it doesn't equate to like one drop of sweat that comes off of our horses in battle. He tells them, like, you do whatever you want, but you hanging out over there and doing all this worship and nice things, and the reward of it has no comparison with the reward of the people who are struggling for the sake of Islam. There's a very heavy discussion that goes on between them, and he actually agrees with him in the end. The point here is that, yes, one can isolate themselves for worship, which comes next, but struggling for the greater good has a lot more reward. This is an important reminder for all of us. So one of the questions that comes up throughout Islamic history is a discussion over integration or isolation. So meaning, should one mix with the people and call them to good and have patience over the harm that comes from it and all of this, or should they just isolate themselves and worship Allah? And this is like such a real question. It's so difficult. So many times you're like, I'm done with this. I'm gonna move to Big Bear and buy a cabin for $80,000 and that's it. I'm done. I'm just retiring at the age of 35. I gave myself a few years, so we'll see. Inshallah, what happens. But this is a very real discussion. It's a very real issue for anyone who's involved in community work. It's a very real issue. So, in the end of the day, the Prophet ﷺ is very clear on it. He said, "Al-mu'min alladhi yukhalitu an-nas wa yasbiru ala adahum khayrun min alladhi la yukhalitu an-nas wa la yasbiru ala adahum." That the believer, is authentic hadith, the believer who mixes with the people and has patience over what comes from it, the harm that comes from it, is better than the one who doesn't mix with the people and does not have patience with the harm that comes from it. It's very clear. The exception to this would be if one knows that by mixing with the people, it's going to absolutely destroy them, their faith. That would be the exception to it. But generally speaking, there's more reward in that struggle. The other one that's discussed by scholars historically is it better to be ghaniyun shakir or faqirun sabir? Is it better to be someone who's wealthy with gratitude or someone who's poor with patience? This is a discussion. They debated it back and forth. Scholars argue different sides and stuff. They'll say, money is such a fitna, because one of the first things you're going to be asked about on the Day of Judgment before your feet even move is where you got your money and how you spent it. Where did you get your money and how did you spend it? And right after prayer, you're asked about prayer, you're asked about your time, you're asked about your money. Where did you get it and where did you spend it? So it's a huge fitna, right? It's a huge test. So then maybe it's better to just not have money. And there's hadith about the Prophet ﷺ about how there will be poor people who enter paradise before anyone else because they don't have anything to be asked about. They didn't have all these responsibilities. And so this is a big question. And usually the preponderant opinion, the stronger opinion is that it's better to be wealthy with gratitude than poor with patience. The condition is that they're both together. If you're wealthy without gratitude, it would have been better to be patient and poor. It would have been better, because that wealth is all going to be tested on the Day of Judgment. But if someone is wealthy and they have gratitude, then they have opportunity to do so much more good that other people don't have. You could start organizations, you can do things people wouldn't even know about, and so much khair can come from it. Like imagine you have enough money to start organizations. You can put seed money for entire organizations, and everything that comes out of it goes in your mizan. It's huge, right? But the problem is, again, if you don't have true gratitude, in the end of the day, every single penny will be asked about. So if the true gratitude is not there, it's a big test. Then what he does in the book, which is really cool, which is one of the nice things about Shaykh al-Qaradawi, is that he brings two examples of historical figures who use the Fiqh of Priorities in their works, and he uses two figures that are normally like opposing camps would claim them. So one camp, he uses Imam al-Ghazali and he uses Ibn Taymiyyah. So like the more if you were to use generalizations, the more Sufi camp would claim Imam al-Ghazali, and the more like conservative, quote unquote, Salafi camp, or whatever you want to call it. I don't really like these terms, but I'm just using it for the sake of illustrating the point, would claim Ibn Taymiyyah. So what he does, he brings both. So, okay, here's Imam al-Ghazali and how he did it, and here's Ibn Taymiyyah and here's how he did it. So no matter which side you're from, you don't have an argument. There's someone you can refer to. So Imam al-Ghazali talks about a number of these, and one of the famous quotes that he uses, which I've mentioned many times, is he says, "ترك ترتيب الخيرات من جملة الشرور," that the leaving of order between good deeds is from bad deeds. The leaving of order between good deeds is from bad deeds. Okay, so this is really, really important to understand. Really important to understand. That it's not just, oh, I'm doing good. It's, you might be doing good, but is a more important, greater good being lost because of the good that you're doing? It's a really difficult question sometimes, but it's one to think about. We can give some examples. This is in relation to those who are like worshippers or those who are righteous people. One of them is forgetting the obligatory because of busying oneself with the optional. So one, for example, will be extreme in wudu or tahara to the point that they don't pray on time. I've heard this before. Brother said, I'm so worried about whether or not I make my wudu properly that I'll make my wudu 20 times, 25 times, 30 times, and then I miss the time for prayer. Obviously, there's probably a mental health issue here as well, but the idea is that it can lead to, you lose the balance. You busy oneself, and then you lose the balance. Another one will be praying qiyam and then missing fajr. So for example, someone will wake up, or they'll stay up, they pray qiyam, it's 1 a.m., 2 a.m., or they stay up because they're working on something or other for the greater benefit of the Muslims and all these things. And the consequence is they miss fajr prayer. So they sleep in past fajr prayer, so priority was missed. Priority was missed. Another one, and this one is, I think, also very interesting to think about, is glorifying the optional and not doing the same for the obligatory. Glorifying the optional and not doing the same for the obligatory. So usually what we do is we don't really feel special when we do something we're required to do. But we feel special when we do something extra. Right? So you do that extra thing, you feel good. But the required thing, you don't feel as good about it. But the Prophet ﷺ narrated that Allah said, مَا تَقَرَّبَ الْمُتَقَرِّبُونَ إِلَيَّ بِمِثْلِ أَدَاءِ مَا افْتَرَضْتُ عَلَيْهِ. That those who are drawing near to me do not draw nearer to me by anything more beloved to me than fulfilling the obligations that I put upon them. So actually the most powerful thing in coming closer to Allah is doing what He's commanded you to do. You should get more pleasure out of praying Fajr than the Sunnah of Fajr. You should get more pleasure out of praying Dhuhr than the Sunnah of Dhuhr. You should get more pleasure from fasting the month of Ramadan than fasting like the 6 days of Shawwal, for example. But sometimes we feel better about the 6 days of Shawwal. Sometimes that's just because we're happy that we did an extra good deed, but sometimes there's actually a hidden disease in the heart that we want to feel like we're better than other people, so we're happy that we did that extra deed that wasn't required of us, and they didn't do it, and look, I'm good. That's actually a sickness in the heart. So it has to be, it's a very, very subtle issue. Another one is to lose the order between two obligations. So for example, someone has a sum of money. That sum of money could be spent to go on Hajj that they haven't made before, so it's a required Hajj, or it could be spent on taking care of their parents who are elderly and they need that money to take care of them. So which one takes priority? The parents take priority. The parents take priority. If you need that money to take care of them, like for example, they have expensive hospital bills or something, you have to pay for them to get the care that they need, then you don't just make Hajj and be like, well, it's Hajj and I have the money and now it's an obligation. It's not, because you actually don't have the money. The money is actually supposed to be going to the parents. So this comes up a lot. Can also happen with two fard kifaya, two communal obligations. Maybe there's two communal obligations. One of them people are doing, the other one people are not doing. So the priority is the one that people are not doing. Very interesting and deep stuff that needs its own discussion. Another area of mistakes is in regards to wealth. So And this ties into the question of being wealthy with gratitude. So one of the mistakes in regards to wealth is leaving something that a person acquires money by in order to engage in optional acts of worship. So a very famous story of Bishr al-Hafi, who was an early scholar and righteous person. He was asked about someone who was very wealthy and they were very successful in business, and they decided to leave their business, and it was halal, obviously. We're not getting into that. Although, I was thinking today, people should really, I would advise people, if you're doing very well in business, depending on what kind of business you're in, please, probably give a lot of money in charity, because a lot of business now is very shady. Even if it's clearly, your product that you're dealing in is halal, but where you get it from, and the people that are affected by it, and, it's, like iPhones, maybe someone sells iPhones, and that's a halal thing to sell. But how many people are being abused in factories in China in order to make the iPhone, right? So you might be making tons of money off selling the item, but the item itself is connected to the oppression of people. So, I think it's a good practice to try to be very charitable if people have done well in business. I'm not saying where you should spend that, that's your choice, but that's just the point. So Bishr was asked about this person who left that and he went into worship. And he said, "Al-Miskeen, ترك حاله ودخل في حال غيره." That this person is unfortunate, feel bad for them. They left their situation and went into the situation of someone else. So basically what he's saying is that person, that was their qadr in life. Their qadr in life was that they were set up and they had the opportunities and they were able to do very well in a halal way and make a lot of money. So rather than leaving that, they should have stayed in it. So he actually continues more. I didn't write it here, but he continues more and he says, had he stayed in this field, he would have been able to have extra money by which he can feed someone who's hungry. But instead, he just made himself hungry. He quit his work so he can do optional deeds, so now he's fasting a lot. So he made himself hungry, but all those people that could have been fed from the money that he could have made in a halal way, they're not getting fed now. So he said he left his situation, went into someone else's. Another one with wealth is spending on voluntary hajj, which I mentioned it before. Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu is actually a narration attributed to him. He said, in the end of time, the companion, in the end of time there will be a lot of hajj with no reason. There will be a lot of hajj with no reason. Travel will be easy for them, and they will have a lot of wealth. It's a scary statement, subhanAllah. Ibn Mas'ud. There will be a lot of hajj with no reason. Travel will be easy for them, and they'll have a lot of money. It's really very interesting. In the end of the day, like I said, human life is more important than hajj. So if you can spend $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 to save human lives, and it's not your required hajj, it's better for you to not make hajj again. It's better for you to save someone's life, or at least elongate their life. So that's Imam Ghazali. We'll start Ibn Taymiyyah, and I'll give one example, and then we'll stop. So Ibn Taymiyyah has also examples of the Fiqh of Priorities. One of those is in the category of changing the value of a deed based on changed conditions. Okay, so changing the value of a deed based on changed conditions. And so an example of this would be, and one of the examples in this in general is the story of the Prophet ﷺ with Aisha and the Kaaba. That the Kaaba as it existed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ and as it exists today is not built on the original parameters of the Kaaba. That's why they have the Hijr Ismail, the little semicircle. Everything between the building of the Kaaba and that semicircle is actually part of the original Kaaba of Ibrahim and Ismail. So the Prophet ﷺ told Aisha, it's a very interesting example of priorities. He told Aisha, if your people had not been new to Islam, I would destroy the Kaaba and build it on its original foundations. If your people were not new to Islam, I would destroy the Kaaba and build it on its original foundation. But he knows, even though he's the Prophet ﷺ, if he destroys the Kaaba and builds it on its original foundations, people are going to freak out. Because the symbol is so powerful that even though he's doing what's right, even though that would be right, he can't do it because people won't be able to handle it. So this is a concept of understanding the priorities here. Another example of this is changing the value of a deed based on changing conditions would be Ibn Qayyim talks about this in detail in the book on the invocation of God. It's translated to Anwab al-Sayyid in Arabic, but in English it's translated as on the invocation of God. And he has a section on this where he talks about how so Quran and dhikr and dua are all highly recommended things to do, right? And the general rule is that Quran is better than dhikr, is better than dua. Because Quran includes dhikr and dua, and because dhikr is better than dua, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ, and the remembrance of Allah is better, bigger. And so this is the general rule. But for a particular person, that might change. And for the same person in different situations, that might change. So, for example, Quran might be better, and maybe that person, they really like Quran. So they usually do Quran. But one day, what they really need is not Quran, what they need is dua. They have this yearning in their heart. What they need at that moment is to make dua. So for them, in that moment, the dua is better than the Quran, for them. Or someone maybe doesn't understand the Quran at all. But when they make dua, they make beautiful dua from their heart. I've seen this a lot with Afghans, actually. Afghans are amazing with dua. I mean, mashallah, my wife's grandmother, rahimahullah, she would literally sit and mention every single member of her family by name in dua. And you're talking like, it's a big family, 60, 100, 150 people, every single person gets mentioned in dua by name. And so, for that person, the dua is better than the Quran, actually. Because the Quran is good, but they don't understand it. The dua, they totally understand it, they're into it, their heart is connected with Allah, and so on. So it can shift. Another example of this, and this is the last one we'll stop with, and it's the same concept of changing the value of the deed based on changing conditions, is to take an opinion that one deems to be weaker, but still valid, in order to show people that it's valid. Okay? So maybe there's an imam that believes that they should read Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud in the Fatiha every time they read out loud. Okay? There's two opinions. We've talked about in Jumu'ah, there's some gentlemen, they like to bother people about this. But there's two opinions. In the Sahaba, they go back to the Sahaba. Some of them, they would read the Fatiha out loud in Salah, saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud, some of them wouldn't. Right? So maybe there's an imam who believes that they should say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And they lead the people for an amount of time. And so every day people are hearing it with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. But the imam knows that the other opinion is also valid. And he doesn't want people to think that it's not valid. So what does he do? It's actually better for him in that case to every now and then read it the other way, without the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So it becomes clarified to people that both are valid options. Same thing as like praying witr in different ways in Tarawih. Usually there's a number of different ways to pray witr. So every so often someone will pray in a different way to clarify to people that this is also acceptable. So that's, even though it might be not as strong as an opinion to the person, but they give it precedence anyways to show that it's okay. So this is very important. So sometimes maybe someone will lead and they won't raise their hands when they go up and down from ruku'. And then the other time they will. Just to show that like this is okay. Maybe sometimes they sit at the end of salat and all they do is they shadu la ilaha illallah with their finger, right? Just a little one time. The next time they'll do it, they hold it from the shadu la ilaha illallah. Next time they do it, they do the moving finger, right? Just to show for themselves also, to realize that this is not an issue that there's one opinion on, and I shouldn't have like such a strong adherence to one opinion over the other one when there's multiple in the sunnah itself. So this is a very important concept. Next time, inshallah, we'll continue with Ibn Taymiyyah.